Sakina was a child bride, married at the age of 16 to a man 13 years older than her. Just a few days after her marriage, she discovered that her husband was having an affair. When she started to ask questions, the beating began. Initially, he would slap her in the face or kick her, but as time passed, he got more violent. He would return home drunk and compel her to behave in bed like the woman he had illicit relationships with. Sakina suffered 3 stillbirths due to forceful sex during her last trimester. Battered and humiliated, Sakina finally confided in her family, who urged her to find ways to appease her husband. She managed to escape to her parents' home, but was promptly sent back. On her return, he became more aggressive, even refusing to give her food and clothing, so she wouldn't dare to escape again. Unable to bear the torture, Sakina consumed sleeping pills to end her life. She succeeded on the third attempt. She was only 24 years old. 50 to 70% of all Indian women face domestic violence. 66% of these victims remain silent due to shame, concern for children, and honor of family. 58% victims report that their families know about the violence but do nothing about it. And 75% of these victims have tried to commit suicide. Living in a violent relationship affects a girl beyond just physical injury. Violence results in multiple and unwanted pregnancies, thereby increasing the likelihood of miscarriage, stillbirth, and even death for the mother. Children of abused mothers are more likely to be malnourished and die before the age of 5. And if they survive, they are more likely to become abusers or victims themselves, perpetuating the cycle of violence. Starting off on my extreme right is Melissa Opreti, Asia Director for the Center for Reproductive Rights and a human rights lawyer. She has significant experience in reviewing policy on human rights issues such as child marriage. Pradnya, Inspector General of Police at Maharashtra headquarters. Pradnya has served in the CBI as well as the Mumbai police, controlling human trafficking in the city. On my left, Flavia Agnes, one of the pioneers of the women's movement. Flavia is the co-founder of non-profit Majlis, an organization that provides quality legal services and secures the lives of thousands of battered women. And to my extreme left, Jamshed Mistry, counsel in the Supreme Court of India. He's routinely asked to be on various government committees and commissions, including the Planning Commission and the Law Commission. I will not get into too much detail because you do have their profiles in your speaker bios and get right into the thick of discussion. So I'd like to start off with you, Flavia. Could you tell us briefly about your personal story and your journey in addressing this issue? And what is the role that the police and the judiciary played in that?
My struggle was a long time ago, and this book, in a way, written in 1984, captures this entire struggle of a middle-class woman facing domestic violence with 3 children and having nowhere to go. And what do you go through in the process? Now, in those days, domestic violence was never talked about. Nobody used to hear about domestic violence, and there were lots of myths shouting domestic violence. For instance, Christian women were not entitled to divorce on the ground of cruelty at the time, and until 2001. I mean, only in 2001 the law got changed. There's always, even among the my parents or women's movement, there's this misconception that domestic violence happens only in the slums, or the husband must be an alcoholic, or a good-for-nothing creature, or there should be a mother-in-law problem and dowry demand. In fact, the buzzword in those days was dowry death, dowry harassment. So if I said none of these are the factors, and my husband is highly competent and holding a very prestigious job, etc., as a company secretary, then people would think something's wrong with me. Like, what's wrong with you? Then you must be doing something. So for a long time, to accept that nothing's wrong with me and that I need help, I need support to come out of this situation, it took about 13 years. And I only did this for the sake of my children when I realized the impact that domestic violence was having on them. So there was an incident when my hand was fractured, and I used to go to a priest for counseling, and he said, why didn't you file a complaint? Why didn't you go to the hospital, from there go to the hospital? And when the X-ray was taken, it was a fracture. I went to the police and registered a case, and even the policemen were shocked to see a middle-class woman at the police station, and anyway they recorded a non-cognizable offense. When I went home and my husband realized I filed, he threatened me that immediately you withdraw the complaint or I'll throw you out of the house. And if you have no support, then even a police complaint doesn't add up to anything at all. It took me years to get out of the situation, and legally we had very little options. Even a divorce option was not available. So after 13 years, in 1980, when the women's movement started, I joined the movement not because of my own issue, but because of the anti-rape campaign. I thought something to do, I should meet other women, otherwise I thought I was going mad. So in order to retain my sanity, I joined. And then around the time I wrote this book to give people an idea that what is domestic violence? What do we mean by violence? Because at that time a girl was raped in Turbe, which is like that term very far from Bombay. Now it's not doesn't seem so far. And when I used to go there and we said we should start something over there. And my first thing was, shouldn't we start something over here? Because there are hundreds and thousands of women who just need to speak to someone, otherwise they'll commit suicide. So can we start something? So my first effort was to start a small organization which is support work called Women's Center. Then after some years, you realize that this is no use, then you should do something more. Meanwhile, I educated myself, I became a graduate, I did my law. And then we set up this legal NGO because I knew the difficulties a woman has approaching the court. There's always a fear that my lawyer, whom I don't pay that much as my husband, will compromise and defeat my rights. So when you say quality legal services, it's not what you get out of the court. You may get a good order, you may not get a good order, but at least a team of women, lawyers who are dedicated and who are committed, and who will not compromise. And he'll be there by your side to understand you, not just as a lawyer, but also as a support person. So that's how Majlis was started in 1989, got registered in 1990. And from there onwards, we've been working with groups, particularly all women group, working in the family court in Mumbai, as well as on the issue of domestic violence across this city. And we have continued in that way.
Great, great. Thank you.
So you can have a look at this book has been translated in many languages, in Marathi, in all South Indian languages, etc. I just got a few copies if people just want to have a look.
We have the copies there, so we can collect
you can have a look at that. I really don't have English copies at this moment, otherwise I would have carried more. It's just in the process of reprinting. But this is a small handbook which has helped a lot of women, and particularly my own clients, that when they come to me and they say, this happens, my husband doesn't give food, my husband looks so good, he looks so respectable, and madam, you won't believe it. And then I give them this book, and they come back 3 days later, and the dialogue changes to, madam, this is happening, that is happening. Madam, you can understand, no, you will believe, you know all this that is happening. So that's the shift. And then there is this confidence, madam, if you can do it, then I can do it also. You know, reading this book has changed my life, given me hope. I know something can be changed. So I feel that most powerful thing that I've done is to write this at a stage when nobody used to talk about domestic violence and shift the discourse away from like dowry related laws to something mundane that happens every day, the humiliation you go through, the economic hardship that you go through, and finally culmination of it was the Domestic Violence Act in 2005.
Right. No, thank you very much, Flavia, for that. I think just taking on from what Flavia said, she's, I think, a unique outlier, I would say, in the sense that she took charge of her life. She had the ability to do that. She did not find support somewhere else. She studied law and started off Majlis. But I don't think everyone or all victims have the opportunity to do that, right? While we were researching, one stat said that only 2% of domestic violence victims sought help from the police. Or even to quote another sector, a seasoned trafficker can transport a girl across state borders for $60 or 1,600 rupees, right? As an officer, as a person who has been close to violence against women issues, what has your experience been? And how have you seen the police perspective change over the years? Has it not even?
Yeah, actually what Flavia mentioned as a personal story is a story of domestic violence in, of women when they approach police or approach any outside agency for help. So it is a story of basically more than anything else, a sense of physical dominance over somebody else within the four walls of the house. That is the general story of domestic violence. And that happens especially because it is reinforced by the fact that there is economic angle to it, that the lady who is suffering it all does not have any other means to get out of that situation. And simultaneously, there are factors of children and
Right.
the home factors, which keep on aggravating the situation, and there is a continuing problem on that. Now, to the extent that it is not a crime like, say, a crime of passion, like, somebody goes assault somebody on the road because of some fight which happened. That is a crime which can be handled by the police as per law in a very dispassionate way. But this kind of crime, it is certainly a very, heinous crime in the sense that you're going on battering the person physically and mentally over a long period of time. And the law says that action should be taken. When the person goes to police, the police come from the same social mindset from which all this is happening, okay? And if you're asking me, the response of the police and whether the training of police and all should make a difference into this mindset, I find that it really is not making any difference into this mindset because of the fact that the social milieu is like that, okay? So training can make a dent into it, but it cannot make a very, very big impact into it. You can go on training police about having attitudes of of sympathy, of having a legal view on those things and all that, but the practice is always something else. Now, when you want to really find a way out of getting this into some kind of a solution mode as far as the police is concerned, it is a problem not merely of women complainants coming to police. It is a problem of any complainant coming to police. It's an attitude problem that the police here, I am from the department and you would look at me as though I'm criticizing my department, but it's a reality that the police is not really concerned with the public as a complainant. Okay, now why would you say that is happening? The entire thing rests on the fact that the incentives for police to look at people as complainants, to look at women victims as complainants, which need to be tackled in the framework of the law, is not towards people's accountability. The accountabilities are towards the political system, the accountabilities are towards the own hierarchy, okay, for which they depend on promotions, for which the political hierarchy for transfers. So people are not on the radar as far as accountability is concerned.
Right.
So especially when you're looking at women's problems, this becomes, even more exaggerated. It's a social concern. It is not, as I said initially, not a crime of passion or not a property offense, which can be looked at extremely logically and away from emotions. This is something else. So this gets exaggerated. The same attitude of police of indifference gets exaggerated in a scenario like this. There are solutions which we can look at, but there has to be, the entire framework of those solutions has to be towards making police more accountable towards the people. Right. Including the women complainants.
And how do you do that?
How do you do that? Now, that is an interesting question. How do you do that? So I had to look at what happens in many countries abroad. I had one interesting reading of something called crime victimization surveys, which take place in many countries abroad. Basically, these are surveys mapping people's experience of crime. Okay, the public experiencing crime. Now in India, we largely depend or fully depend on gauging the extent of crime only on police statistics, okay, which is minimized. People coming to police stations not necessarily get their crimes registered at FIRs, including crimes against women, which are very massively minimized. Now, if we need some other parameter which can gauge what is really happening in society. And I felt this crime victimization surveys which take place, I've seen some reports of US and Hong Kong and Australia. They do these things wherein, what is the reality on a scenario? What is the reality on a crime, say, crime against women? What is the reality out there? Is taken from these public surveys. You have say a figure like you have a 20 crime recorded against, about violence against women in your police stations, but this public survey, if it shows that the crime is actually 100, okay? So there is a minimization. The hierarchy of the police who constantly tell the police station, look, don't minimize crime, record crime, but really nothing happens there. Then the incentive comes in for the police station to reduce these gaps in subsequent surveys, right. Okay? So these kind of incentives need to be put in place where police just telling them record crime and be sensitive to women is not going to make much difference in the longer term. Right. I think these kind of ways in which you can align the incentives towards doing the right thing, towards increasing accountability, right. I think that may help. Right.
So I'd like you to hold that thought, particularly because it's interesting that you talk about that there shouldn't be just one parameter, but there should be a number of other parameters or surveys that should be able to give one a complete picture of what's actually the reality, which will then lead into incentivizing the police to bringing that crime down, right? So I'd like to hold on to that thought while I go to Jamshed. Flavia alluded to the women's movement in the 70s and 80s, which have enabled some really strong laws, right? So the PWDVA, which is really the Anti-Domestic Violence Act, is globally known to be a pioneering act, right, on paper. So as a lawyer, in your opinion, how easy or how difficult do we make it for a violated woman, right? It is anyway difficult for any citizen to access law. How difficult or easy do we make it for a violated woman to access this law? And what is the role of law given that we have mindsets of police which are patriarchal, right? So we often have police judging these cases themselves. So if a woman goes in, they tend to give out judgments saying that this is a very trivial issue, why don't you go back and sort it out, sure. Right? So what do you see the role of judiciary?
I was very interested in fact, what was stated in the report, where they say that it has gone up, the awareness has gone up almost 5 times, if that's what I heard. I mean, you have to take 2 scenarios into account. We have the women in an urban scenario, and then we have the rest of India, which is completely rural. See, the lack of availability of awareness and the fact that most of these crimes sometime against women do happen with the connivance or the conjunction with family members, just makes it all that more difficult. It's, the fact of the matter is that, yes, people are more aware today, you know, with computerization, with globalization, you know what, that yes, there has been an issue and what do I do? So who do you actually go to? I'll give you a very fine example of someone, you know, who happened to be you know, ultimately a client of mine. And she had a very, very serious, very well-educated person again, someone who said that nobody was willing to believe that there was such an issue, there was such a problem. And she didn't know initially whom to confide. She said, should I confide in my family? They said, no, if I do that, then as the trailer said, you know, they asked her typically to go back. Then what do I do? Which police station do I go to? And should I go to a police station or should I approach an NGO? That was the second question. And then finally, the question was, what about the law? Should I read it up on my own? And what is available online? So, and the other thing that I think we really need to touch upon, and which we've kind of missed, is that please remember that is the time when the lady is undergoing complete stress. I mean, some of them have post-traumatic stress disorders, undergoing you know, such situations. So she needs help instantly. What then typically happens is then you go to a police station. Yes, now the law says that there must be a lady officer who has to record your statement. By the time she goes there, she records it. Most of them are extremely busy and all sorts of other duty. They get, you know, by the time it is actually recorded, it is, you know, you're called to the police station 15, 20 times. And that whole process starts. Then there's the question of, can I actually mention it? How does it affect my day-to-day life? It becomes a very, very serious problem. And then the Domestic Violence Act today, as Flavia will also agree, is considered a quasi-civil process. It's not even criminal in its...
I'm sorry, but can you explain what you mean by it's a quasi-civil process?
It's semi.
Yes.
I'm sorry, we use Latin terms.
No,
but
civil, what do you mean by a civil law?
In the sense, you know, we have, I mean, very, very broadly, we have the Criminal Procedure Code. I mean, certain, if it's a crime against women, then that's one area which is dealt with, you know, the courts that deal with criminal matters. And this is a special court which will deal with, you know, domestic violence per se. And the question is then, once it does go to court and, you know, somebody appears on the other side, although there is a strict time frame that it must be completed within 6 months, it will be wonderful to actually check how many such domestic violence cases are actually completed within 6 months. So we have a very, very serious issue here. And I think it has to be a combination of several factors. I think as far as the police are concerned, yes, better sensitization, and at all levels. Computerization is an issue. You know, today you have tablets. What prevents you from taking it down instantly? You know, so I think we must make good use of that. The use of a clinical psychologist at some level, I think that's very, very essential. And the other thing is that why don't we borrow, you know, good practices that are prevalent in other countries? I mean, why are we shying away from that? Somehow in India we shy away from these practices. So I think this is you know, something that really needs to be done. And let's follow a very, very strict timetable. I'm sure that any matter can actually be decided in a particular time frame.
Right. No, it's great that you talk about this time frame. Sure.
I just want to clarify this act and the confusion there. It's not just quasi-civil or quasi-criminal. We have a criminal law where cruelty against wives is an offense and dealt with quite stringently. That's called Section 498A. and there is 3 years punishment but immediate arrest, etc. Now that law has got a lot of badnaam, so to say, that women are misusing it. The minute women use it, we think they are misusing it. Though the number of cases there are very insignificant, and compared to the population of India, it just doesn't matter compared to the statistics which say how many women are actually getting beaten. The second one, the Domestic Violence Act, is a civil law for remedies, because the criminal law only provided punishment. But many times women did not want punishment, they wanted their certain rights to be protected. That is their right to maintenance, right to shelter, right to protection from like ouster injunction, what is called in some countries, that a husband will not beat her, will allow her to stay. So these are civil remedies. But the location is the magistrate court. But this case doesn't originate in a police station. The government has set up a certain machinery, or supposed to have set up a certain machinery, which is called protection officers. And the act itself has very simplified formats. So the protection officer can just tick mark what the woman is saying, what is her grievance and what does she want, and put it in the magistrate court without the help of the lawyer. The whole idea here was that she doesn't need to have a lawyer and she doesn't need to go to a police in case a woman is scared of going to police. And when a case like this comes to the police station, the police must also refer the case to the protection officer. This is about the act en message. I just want to say one comment on your entire presentation, and all the time we talk. That act defines domestic violence very broadly. Physical violence, emotional violence, abuses, all of that, sexual violence, and economic violence. That means not giving money or harassing of money, all of that would be violence. And yet, our entire framework in all of us, when we say domestic violence, we want to see bruises. We're still onto the physical terms of domestic violence. And same thing happens in the court also. We don't look at domestic violence broader than what we used to do under 498A or under the IPC sections of assault. So now we need to understand what is domestic violence, what is the capacity of the protection officer to understand what is domestic violence, what is the capacity of the magistrate to understand what is domestic violence. Only then they will not accuse women of filing false cases. Because the act at one level is very broad, but the social conditioning still remains at the same level. Or if she doesn't have marks, if her bones are not broken, if her eye is not black, she's not really a victim of domestic violence. And if it is abuse, he must have abused him, he must have abused it, it's on par. They both are equal. And why is this woman coming to court? So unless we change those parameters and see that what does this woman want, Domestic Violence Act is a relief-oriented act. It has to give something to the woman that she needs protection, she needs maintenance, she needs a children's custody. So it is a civil remedy. That's why we call it civil remedy.
Right. Thank you, Flavia. Jamshed, just to continue your string of thought, you spoke about judiciary and that time frame that is required to solve that case. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges that the judiciary faces based on, say, the police not having enough evidence or the police treating the case lightly, right? Because that is the starting point where you need to build up evidence so that you can have a foolproof case.
Sure.
Is that a deterrent for justice?
I think that's been a huge sort of debate in India about judiciary. They say justice delayed is justice denied, as broad as it can get. Yes, pendency is a big problem. We have fast track courts to actually look at these issues. I think let me give you a quick example, because I do a lot of work in Canada, and what is the real difference? As an example, what happens is in Canada you reach a stage where if everything, for example, in a litigation where evidence is required, for example, it comes up to a stage where the judge says, if everything is complete, you get what is known as a trial certificate. It is done, it is over. After that, God forbid, if you take an adjournment, your client's insurance company will have to pay for it. In India, unfortunately, the question of adjournments is an issue. You are allowed adjournments. It just depends. I mean, sometimes it is required, sometimes it's not. But I think but it again depends upon a judge, a lawyer, and I think the capacity of the police. I mean, we've seen, police being able, for example, the crime branch in Bombay, it took over a particular case just now. It was able to resolve it very, very quickly. I think we are fortunate. But they do require a lot of resources, much better training. I think that's something. And to be able to, so I think training is the key to a lot of these things.
Okay, great. So Melissa, finally coming to you to bring it all together. So we have the police, we have the law, we have judiciary, and now we're talking about various services that a woman is supposed to get under the civil law. So even if she doesn't want to go to court, she's entitled to certain services, whether it's health or counseling, to be able to support herself. But it is clear that these things are not happening, right? The police is not working with the judiciary, or the woman does not have access even to this protection officer. And whether it's domestic violence, child marriage, trafficking, this link is broken, right? What, according to you, can fill this gap, and which is the best stakeholder to do that?
I wish it was as easy as saying that there's one thing that one person or one stakeholder can do to solve these massive problems, because it would make it much easier for all of us to address these issues. I mean, sadly, violence against women is a global epidemic. It exists in all societies. It doesn't just exist here, but it exists everywhere. And it has been around for a very long time. I think what's important is how we look at the issues as we're, searching for solutions. And as a human rights lawyer, I tend to look at these issues from a human rights perspective. And, why is that important? How is that helpful? Well, first of all, when you look at these issues from a human rights standpoint, it really allows you to put the woman at the center of the problem and really sort of examine the many different ways in which violence against women affects them, whether it's in the form of child marriage or in the form of domestic violence, slapping, or kicking, beating, all the other forms that have been documented, or trafficking. It really allows you to look at the array of implications. And clearly, violence against women is not just an issue of physical security. It's not just an issue of women's health. It's not just an issue of privacy, but it concerns all of these things, and at a very fundamental level, it's an issue of women's dignity. The other thing that looking at these issues from a human rights framework allows me to do is really sort of, question and ask, well, what is the role of the government in all of this? And we do know that the government has a key role to play in terms of introducing laws and policies that will guide individual actions and, prescribe punishments for bad behavior. And we've seen the Indian government do this, as many other governments have done across the world. But what we're also seeing is that it's not enough to have laws and policies, right? I mean, there are tons of them everywhere, but have these practices stopped? So now the question is, what happens next? Whose responsibility? Which stakeholder is responsible for making sure that these laws and policies are effective? Is it NGOs? Or, is it the police? Or is it someone else? Well, my answer to that is, well, the buck stops with the government at the end of the day. I think NGOs have a very important role to play in facilitating the implementation of laws and policies, in promoting conversations about how they can be improved and made better, in establishing legal accountability for violations, whether through legal services that are provided to individual women, or things like strategic litigation, which are more, like cases that are filed in the public interest that raise, social justice issues and seek broader systemic solutions to problems. Of course, law enforcement has a key role to play in actually making sure that remedies are available to women. But, at the end of the day, whose job is it to coordinate all of this, to take steps that are meaningful and that are effective and that actually result in the problems being solved. It really is the government. And whether we look at, when we look at these issues, whether it's child marriage in India or domestic violence or even maternal mortality, which is also a form of violence against women because, women shouldn't normally be dying during pregnancy and childbirth. And when you think about the nature of the experience, it really is, it does amount to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment to, when women are put in situations where, they're denied access to maternal health care, or even being forced to continue an unintended pregnancy to term, being put at risk of, becoming pregnant, when you don't want to, and then being forced to continue it to term because you don't have access to safe abortion services, even in a country where it's legal. In India, for example, that is also a form of violence against women. So, it exists in many forms, and of course there are laws and policies everywhere. It would take years to go through everything and analyze everything, but I think at the end of the day, it is the government, but of course civil society, I think we have a very important role to play as facilitators in making sure that these laws and policies are implemented and that, that the government is questioned when it does fail. Because I think what's clear from today's conversation is that these issues are massive, and these issues, since they have, they implicate women's dignity and survival. It's not just about having a good life, it's also about being able to live. And that there's an urgency. And, effective solutions are long overdue. But I think, it has to be a collective effort. And, actually one of the things that inspired me to join this field and become a reproductive rights lawyer was the realization that as a lawyer, I can actually make a difference and do something to address the reproductive health issues. I mean, one doesn't typically make those connections, but I was very inspired by a lecture given by a professor when I was in graduate school, where, it became so clear to me that, just by lending my voice, I could make a difference. And I think that's what all of us need to recognize, that, each and every one of us can play a role, whether it's by lending our voice or lending our resources, lending our time, that, if we work collectively, then we can, address some of these problems.
Right. I think you touched upon a little bit on that we need to play a facilitating role, right? That the civil society needs to play a facilitating role. In your experience, and I know that you have experience across Asia, how have you seen this role being played out? What is it that NGOs are doing? And what is being done in other countries that can probably be brought to India and replicated here? So for example, we know that Nepal recognizes marital rape, right? Whereas India does not. Where do you find can we use international best practices in India, and how can we facilitate better?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's important for everyone to know and to understand that international law may seem very abstract and just like a set of, words or sentences written in international treaties, but the government of India has signed and ratified these treaties, so it is legally obligated to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights at home. And I think that's really important to India, attaining its aspiration of being a world superpower, to sort of be able to lead in that respect. When we, talking about more practical strategies, however, for making that happen, I mean, if you look at Nepal, for example, what I've seen is that litigation, which people are typically very averse to, can be a very useful strategy in gaining recognition of certain issues as human rights issues or as violations of rights. And what you said about marital rape, you mentioned marital rape specifically, which is a very pervasive form of sexual violence that happens in all societies. In Nepal, marital rape was not recognized as a crime until someone filed a case in the Supreme Court of Nepal seeking legal recognition. And I think that was definitely a milestone, because you see what happens is, you file a case, you get a good decision, but of course that decision is only as useful if it's actually implemented. So implementation is key, but a good legal decision can also give can give the entire community and society, civil society, a basis for taking a conversation forward. And likewise in Nepal, again, litigation has been used very strategically, and in India too, for seeking the enforcement of laws. In India, in Nepal, child marriage is an issue that has been addressed, and issues have been issued by, orders have been issued by the Supreme Court to very specific government agencies saying that they need to enforce the laws that exist. So, while change is a long-term process, but there are ways to make every step a milestone, and I see these successes as critical milestones. At the end of the day, they do add up to change. And they're all, but at change happens one step at a time. So now with these court orders in Nepal, for example, what we are doing with our partners is we're using these court orders as a basis for going back to the government and really engaging with them. Asking the National Women's Commission, what are you doing to address this issue? Asking the Ministry of Health, what are you doing? What's your role? Because child marriage, violence is obviously a huge aspect of it, but there's a whole continuum of reproductive harms that also are associated with child marriage. So child marriage may be one issue, but it affects it has implications for a very broad range of rights. And so, court orders in Nepal have given us a basis for really pushing the government to do more, for pushing them to prioritize this issue, and we're very hopeful that in the near future that we will be able to make the government more visibly do that. I mean, one great thing that the government of Nepal did as a result of a lot of legal advocacy is that it has co-sponsored a resolution, a historic resolution that was adopted by the Human Rights Council last year on child early and forced marriage, which is considered, a huge political step forward in, acknowledging child marriage as a human rights concern and in building global political consensus and commitment to address the issue. I'm sorry to say that the Indian government refused to co-sponsor it. They were involved in the discussions around it, but one of the reasons why they refused to co-sponsor it was they did not want to recognize that child marriage is related to gender discrimination and sexual and reproductive health harms. They were very insistent on focusing on child marriage as a result of poverty and something that will take care of itself as poverty kind of takes care of itself over time. By doing that, they were basically refusing to take responsibility to act now to address the issue. So that was somewhat disappointing, but and that's also the reason why advocacy has to continue, and legal advocacy is so important, and legal accountability is so important.
Great. Thanks for that. And continuing with her international outlook, earlier you talked about using surveys, using other mechanisms to keep the government accountable. In your opinion, who is responsible for doing that, right? Because the government itself obviously is not going to be doing that. So which stakeholder takes on that responsibility? Is it an NGO who is best suited to do that? We have some examples within the domestic violence framework itself where we have NGOs looking at government policies, making sure that the laws, whether they're actually being implemented on the ground or not. In your experience, how has it worked?
Yeah, typically in developmental areas, there's a lot of activity which takes place from the society, or there is a interest because they are it's money is involved, and therefore there is a lot of the social pressures on government to do certain things on policy and implementation, which does not exist in these areas. Okay, for issues like policing, the same pressures are not working. So we need to have these pressures coming in on the government. Government is not going to say no, but I see a sense of passivity in how it works. I think if it is pushed towards, with data, because I think that really makes a difference into how policies get framed and then how implementation is monitored.
Right.
So, because everywhere the concern is basically on very poor implementation. Policies and laws, we have a lot of them.
Right.
So how do you get a good implementation is by monitoring the progress, okay? And that is not possible if it is just on hearsay basis or impressions basis. It has to have some solid databases. So I think, so this was my point, that it would be worthwhile to bring in this accountability mechanism in policing and related areas by doing this activity either from the NGO side. That is a very good thing, because the data is out in public and saying that these are your performances on this is not good. But to me, ideally it should be done by the government, and it monitors its progress. Okay, 15 minutes up, she says.
Right. No, thank you for that. But just moving on a little bit, you know, this side of the panel seems to be more around, you know, let's make the government more accountable. The buck stops with the government. But right now it really doesn't, right? And it will take a long time before it does. So what do you see the role of an NGO right now? Not only Majlis, but what are some of the NGOs, what are some of the roles that they are playing right now that donors over here actually could fund to make sure that we're pushing the government and the police to be more accountable?
NGOs played a very important role in bringing this act about in 2005, and it was quite a revolutionary act. And the rules framed under it in 2006 also are extremely powerful and very good. But in fact, nobody pays attention to them later. And what, according to me, is biggest lacuna is that you have these protection officers there, but they do not know what is their role. Though a legal aid is specified as a stakeholder, the legal aid doesn't know that it is a stakeholder. The police do not know what is their role under the act. They only know their role as IPC people, either it is in IPC or not in IPC. There is no convergence model between them. That the protection officer to the legal aid officer to the police, how does it actually converge, and how does it converge with the judiciary? And I think these are the big lacunae. And while NGOs cannot do the role of the state, there has to be mechanisms where the NGO, which is an expert, can work along with the agency, just hand-holding or teaching them, because that has not been told and that's not been done at all. You have a judge over there, you have a police over here, you have a protection officer over there. But just bringing it down to very basics, that do's and don'ts, very simply, even for the police. See, at some level, we have been staying outside the system and blaming the system that this doesn't work. We have not been working along with the system. And I think something inside the framework of the law and within the system to see actual concrete data where it has worked and where it has not worked. What are the best practices that are getting generated into the system itself, and where the magistrate or the protection officer has not worked at all. Today we are working in the Commissionerate office in Pune, and we are monitoring the data that's coming from all the districts of what cases get filed. Today there are no systems, there are no MI system, there's no monitoring systems at all. And the data is manually computed. It's very difficult to track that. Even so, there's hardly any system to put there that what should be the register, what should the columns be. There's nothing like that. So we feel that this is a very important area of intervention, that what is the judiciary supposed to do, what is the protection officer supposed to do. I think this area, if we really work on it, will be really good. But I just want to show you this report. This is on the rape victim support group, where there's so many stakeholders like the prosecutor, the judge, the police, etc. Nobody has ever spoken to each other at all. And this was a stakeholder meeting where we got all of them, the top brass, to speak to each other. So what does the judiciary face from the prosecution? What does the prosecution feel from the police? Where are the gaps? And we're following up this practice so that, at least they know what are the lapses within the system for the other agency. So that it is like at least somewhere communication starts. We never had a convergence model before, though the laws envisaged a convergence model.
Absolutely. So now we're saying that the law is in place, it asks for convergence, but there is not, and non-profits across the spectrum, whether they're Majlis or not, are trying to build the capacity of these various stakeholders to come together to actually just implement what the Act says anyway should be done. Great. So I think just concluding thoughts, because we're running out of time. We have a room full of potential funders over here. What would be your ask from them? What is the role of philanthropy, and what are, say, the top one thing, if you had to tell them to do, what would you ask them to fund?
Well, you know, the theme of today's discussion is violence against women, and I think everyone in this room agrees that at the core, violence against women is a legal issue. It has many dimensions, but you know, there's no getting around the law or avoiding the law in sort of trying to address this massive problem. So from my point of view as a human rights advocate, and I think as a lot of studies show, there is an urgent need to really recognize this issue as a human rights concern. And you know, doing that means really supporting legal accountability strategies. We know that there are millions of laws and policies on the books, but they're not going to mean anything. They're not going to be of any use to women unless women are able to use them, unless they are operationalized. So I think legal accountability strategies, which may range from documenting violations, exposing them, filing cases, broad public interest cases, as well as doing legal advocacy with a range of legal entities and mechanisms, both at the national level as well as international level, is really critical to having any kind of impact and, you know, really raising the profile of these issues as social justice issues.
Right, thank you. Pradnya?
Yeah, taking forward from what Melissa said, actually, making the government more accountable through these ways is one thing. But second, very important thing, I think, is also, you know, what Flavia mentioned in the beginning, the support group structures for the affected women at local levels, you know, which are not, it should not be part of government, because then it becomes very bureaucratic. It should be a non-governmental activity, which then becomes a pressure group on government to act also. You know, so I think that is very, very critical as a very short-term and immediate acting measure. But long-term, it should be on the basis of making the government more accountable.
Right. Flavia?
I have said my points actually. I mean, what you
One
said.
thing that
yeah.
you would want them
no,
to.
one thing is this accountability systems have to be in place. A convergence model have to be built up, and capacity building has to be integrated into the system. And today it's not there. And I think that's a very important measure, and I think many times we have failed because we have not looked at it, and we continually say the laws are not working, and we think the judges are not sensitive, police are not sensitive. And according to me, we should discard the word sensitive, and we should come more to accountability. Because the law is very clear, are you following the law or are you not following the law? Because sensitivity goes into anything at random.
Right. So making it less ambiguous.
No, and it's accountability. Are you doing what the law is telling you to do? And I think that's where our efforts must be, and we should strengthen those systems.
Absolutely. Jamshed,
Yeah.
last thoughts?
I mean, last but not the least, I think when the court appoints you in what is known as an amicus appointment, one thing that you suddenly realize is that, like, oh my gosh, we have 20 respondents on the other side and I don't have any money. What do I do? So I think that's one. A lot of work, a lot of issues in courts today where you have an individual or someone who actually comes forward to fight litigation finds that at some point of time his money dries out. And I think that's really where they must take a look. I'm not saying that other stakeholders in the process don't, of course they do. But I think that's one. The second thing is also on awareness and education. I think that is extremely important. That's where funding must come there, because it's very interesting. You're fighting a system. You're fighting a mindset, and for that, as much good money that comes in for something like this would be, I think, more is less. That's the situation today.
Great. With that, I think we will close this session and open up for a Q&A. I saw a hand go up there. Just a few instructions. If you could please direct it to a particular panelist so that we can have more questions. And I would urge you not to make a comment, but please ask questions. We have got these panelists in, so I will encourage you to grill them. Yes, the lady there.
My question is for Jamshed, I think probably the whole panel, but Jamshed. I've been working in this area for about 12 years, so this was a very, very key part of today's talk for me. A very senior cop told me once that if we had fast-track courts that were not really myths, everything would change, because by the time, he says, we arrest people very quickly, but by the time they come up for trial, the victim, who's already traumatized in a family, has been repeatedly threatened and they withdraw their statements. So this today seems to be one of the biggest problems, and the Home Ministry also have an email from them where they said, our solution to gang rapes and brutality against women are fast-track courts. What really is a fast-track court? I mean, after Nirbhaya's case took 7 months. After that, there have been many brutal rapes. They haven't even heard of trials. Could you clarify that for us, please?
Sure. I think each, I mean, the term fast track, as it's supposed to mean, is supposed to say that there's something that needs to be done very urgently, and therefore, can you please compress all, the sort of, the evidence taking as well as the final decision within a period of time. The real problem is that there is no actual time limit or time frame. That's the real problem, and there's something else that you will be very interested in knowing. That if, for example, the Supreme Court remands a matter to the High Court, they do say that you must finish it in a particular period of time. And if it is not, the particular judge actually has to give reasons why he was not able to do so. I think so accountability, as Flavia says, is something very, very important. And that'll, the onus should be, but it should not also, anything quick should not affect the interests of justice. I think, so that's the balance. That's what it really should be.
I want to answer that question.
Sure.
According to me, there's nothing like fast track. All courts must be fast track only. Delay is not an inherent characteristics of the judiciary at all. And in Mumbai or in Maharashtra, we have for all child sexual abuse cases special courts. And there's a mandate under the law that all child sexual violence cases will get over within a year, and they do. They sensitize judges here, there's special courtrooms here, and within 1 year the matters are over. Now when the case is extremely complicated, like you have 5 children who are mentally or physically challenged, who have been violated, and you have 10 accused, cross-examining these children through an interpreter. Now it cannot be a fast track. It has to take its course, and the judge has to give time for each one of them to cross-examine, have the interpreter there, the child must understand the question. It is a long and very tedious process. So if you cut short it and say 3 months trial or 6 months trial, for instance, Nirbhaya case, Nirbhaya was not there, Nirbhaya was dead and gone. And there was so much focus on it, it's only medical evidence ultimately. So in that sense, it is a very watertight case. Now you have like cases with so many accused, so many victims all coming together in one court. It cannot be fast track court. And I would urge all of you to take that term fast track out of your system so that we have regular courts that work well for all, and not spectacles that one case works and 99 do not work. It should be that dedicated courts. We do have dedicated courts for child sexual abuse and adult women sexual abuse, and these courts must work within the stipulated time. That's it. And there's nothing like this special case or that special case.
Great. Any more questions? Yes, sir here, and then the lady in the black. Yes, Sunil.
I have a question for Melissa.
Yes.
Tomorrow, I believe, is International Women's Day.
Yes.
And I was wondering what message you could suggest we could send out in terms of a specific web link or any way that a viral email can be generated, so that all of us in the room, if I may venture to suggest this, could send mails out to as many people as we can to alert the world, or to people in our worlds, to this issue that we are trying to address here. And especially within Muktangan, which I represent, and I'm a managing trustee of it, I'd like to at least share this message with the 3,000 and odd women that we have contact with in our organization.
So he works, he has founded a non-profit called Muktangan, and he wants to know what message would you want anyone in this room as a person of influence to send out to the women they know on International Women's Day tomorrow?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, I think something like even, you know, stand up for women's rights now can be a very powerful message with an emphasis on the now, because I think, you know, there is an urgency, and I think the key to sort of, you know, what we want governments to do the most, what we want, and not just governments. I mean, you know, what I said earlier about how the buck stops with the governments doesn't mean that other people have no role in all of this. But I think what's really important is that it has to be on everyone's radar now to do something, to come together, to act now, because, you know, the solutions are long overdue. And, you know, the more we wait, it just, you know, it's just something that will, you know, continue and will fester. It's not going to go away by ignoring it, you know, like the Indian government likes to think, oh, with poverty, child marriage will end by itself. It's not that kind of, you know, we're confronted by something that's much more profound and, you know, is really serious and is really urgent. So something as, I think, short as that, but you know, that conveys the idea that, you know, it's important to stand up, that everyone needs to stand up for women's rights and dignity now can be a good message.
Great. And the last question, the lady in the black.
Yeah, hi, my name's Aparna. I just had a question for the panel, whoever wants to answer, is to what extent do you actually think that economic empowerment kind of goes towards solving these issues? I mean, it sounds like a very basic and broad question, because we've heard both things, right? That obviously that economic inequality becomes a reason for the violence between man and woman, and at the same time people from different higher economic strata are also subject to it. So generally, as a kind of plan going forward, I mean, how have you found women who are more economically empowered to be able to deal with this better?
Right. I think I'll direct that to Flavia, since she does engage with women from all strata of society.
Yeah, if you have it doesn't matter which class of society you come from. For many women, the class is an acquired class of the husband. Independently, they do not have any class, and if the husband stops supporting them, they become without class. So I would categorize the women who are earning and have an independent income and the women who do not have. But if you belong to the upper strata and if you don't have an income and you're totally dependent upon husband, then you're very scared to move out because your economic standard will get lowered. But if you are a woman who's earning and still you're facing humiliation, you have more options to walk out because at least you have a basic income to support yourself. Now these are very important questions. And if you're a poor woman and you're earning, you have better options than if you're a woman who is not earning. So I would think economic independence is very vital. And in fact, for 13 years, I had to stay in the marriage because I was not working. And for me, economic independence becomes the core for women's independence. How you use that economic independence is another matter. But this is non-negotiable as far as I am concerned.
I think with that, we will have to end this panel. I would like to thank all my panelists. It was an extremely insightful conversation. And thank you for being a wonderful audience.